Let's talk a little bit about confirmation bias. This is really important to consider when you're looking at argument and you're thinking about how to be critical, but also how to recognize where you sit in the framework of an argument. So what you have to understand about confirmation bias is that frequently it comes from an element of cognitive dissonance. Now, psychologically speaking, we are most comfortable when things are happening the way that we agree with them happening. So when we are faced with a scenario that we disagree with, particularly a belief or an ideology, we experience something called cognitive dissonance. If the cognitive dissonance is strong enough, then it can work on us to ultimately alter our values or our beliefs. So if you think early about the previous lecture where we talked about the sender and the receiver of a message having values, both sides, this is where a message really comes into play in terms of helping the sender either alter their message or the receiver alter the reception of that message. So cognitive dissonance happens in a lot of ways. So first of all, it's what we know. Culture plays a role in that to a degree. Religion to a degree. Our home and our family plays a role in what we know. And our base knowledge about the world at large plays a huge role in what we know and in how much cognitive dissonance we might experience. So we reside primarily in a comfort zone. This is what we know, what we think we know, what we like knowing, and what we expect to know about anything. When dissonance occurs, ideally, in a perfect world, it would lead to a growth. It doesn't always lead to growth. It can lead to a change, however. When what we know, think we know, like knowing, and expect to know, it faces an obstacle or something that is working to alter our understanding, it can result in things that we don't expect. It can result in unknown reactions or responses, unknown consequences to a degree. It can give us new experiences, and ultimately and hopefully it will give us new ideas. Now, I'm thinking about this in the most optimistic of terms, of course. So when we look at confirmation bias and cognitive dissonance, it helps to have that baseline of understanding about how our brains function. If you think about anything in your world that ever causes you to argue, you reside in a place of comfort about what you know. And that could come from possibly your home, your family, your religion, your culture, etc., etc. Okay. Now, there are a couple of ways that we reach dissonance, or that can impede our dissonance, that can impede our growth. And the first one is directionally motivated bias. So when we have a directionally motivated bias, it's a default strategy. And so because we're cognitive misers anyway, as thinkers, we like to keep things comfortable. There's an inherency pattern in the things that we continue to seek as far as what we understand. Hey, Clover. Dog's barking. If we were to experience cognitive dissonance and our bias is wrong, it could cause us a psychological cost. It could give us a consequence psychologically that could result in kind of a negative emotional reaction. So we become very, very miserish when we are challenged with a change, something that might allow us to grow. And ultimately, emotions play a very important role in biased reasoning. If we're comfortable, it reduces our cognitive dissonance, which often will reinforce our bias. Now, if you think about what bias ultimately is, a bias is a tendency toward one idea over another. That can come from any place. If we go back to that earlier chart, it goes back to what we know. Our biases might emerge in our culture, in our religion. It may come from our family discussions. It may come from the things that we know about life from our experience. Dissonance causes an antagonism within ourselves, and it can cause some difficult growing pains, basically. So here are some examples. something that, especially today, people tend to think that socialism is a form of communism. Well, we know that it isn't. But if we're comfortable experiencing socialism as something foreign and unnatural to being, say, an American citizen, then we may distrust it, much like we distrust things like communism or fascism. If you think about the middle part of the 20th century, communists will destroy democracy. That led to the domino theory. It led to a lot of warlike and policing measures that the United States took around the world. And more recently, we have people who argue that the Holocaust was a hoax. A lot of the reason for that is because this is a dissonance that people can't quite come to terms with. The fact that millions of people would be put to death creates kind of this uncomfortable place. So it's easier to just deny it. Flat earthers, same thing. It doesn't make sense that the world is round, right? But then it does. So I think depending on where your dissonance occurs, where it emerges, that is where your bias kind of pervades whatever type of experience you're having, whether it allows you to grow or not. Okay, now that's all directionally motivated. So this is avoiding distress when we have a directionally motivated bias. When we have an accuracy motivated bias, this tends to be related to fear and anxiety. So if we have an accuracy bias, it's because we want to keep safe. We try to rely on facts that we have experienced personally. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's a fact generally or globally, but it's something that is motivated by our fear. So if I were to lock all of my doors consistently, and maybe I lock them multiple times, I mean, some people might say, well, that's a bit of OCD, but also that might actually be a result of an experience that I've had, or a fear or an anxiety that I have that causes me to ensure that my doors are continually locked. Now, I might live in a city and perhaps I live in an area where there's a high rate of crime. This would be perpetuated by the experience that I have within that community area. If you think about the broken window theory, this idea that more crime occurs in areas that are kind of run down and derelict, that's ultimately there's research surrounding that, which you can look up in another way, but there's some accuracy motivated bias that allows that to even be a framework for understanding. But what's interesting is that in that study, they recognized that an accuracy-motivated bias actually did perpetuate some of that dereliction that would occur in certain communities. So some really interesting things to think about there. So bias happens in a lot of ways. More and more these days, we live in an era where the news that we get is news that we ultimately choose, because the access to information that we have is it's not limited. It's extraordinary how much information you actually have access to, but how much are you actually seeking out? That's the big question. So we recognize that polarization data exists, and polarization data is used by certain outlets to perpetuate this echo chamber philosophy, which we're going to get into, where an idea is bias driven, whether it's directionally or accuracy motivated. So polarization data tends to skew the truth by presenting the evidence that suits the argument at hand. The data can be manipulated because it will reinforce existing beliefs, which would reduce cognitive dissonance for a lot of people by perpetuating their existing beliefs and creating a deeper schism. So it separates the two sides of the issue into these polar opposites, rather than recognizing the facets that come in between. So often this data is manipulated in a way to make more money, whether it's for groups who stand to gain from it, or for sales on the information. So this could be something like if we think about the National Enquirer and a picture of Bat Boy on the cover, that's essentially at its heart a form of polarization data. It's manipulating images or stories to present to you a story of the wild and the fantastic, which might, it might fulfill a need for the audience to live on the wild side to some degree. And I think that that's how polarization data works, because it's not just people who believe in the data that buys that information or buys that periodical, but it's people who disbelieve it because they perhaps want to see what the other side is saying and maybe scoff at it a little bit more deeply. So polarization data is really, really interesting, because it can be used on both sides in many ways. So those are some of the ways that bias is perpetuated. All right, now let's move into kind of a different idea and talk about this affective intelligence theory. Ultimately, emotion and reason allow us to survive over time. This is kind of the idea of the survival of the fittest, right? Fear and anger keeps us from engaging with certain groups or certain communities. But what happens is when we have a fear or an anger, we often perpetuate the bias that already exists for us. If we have fear and anxiety, it increases our surveillance, which leads us to more attentiveness. So what happens is we're basically constructing this echo chamber. It's like a box around our head because our fear or our anger or our anxiety helps us to kind of remain and kind of bounce off the walls of this echo chamber, which creates more attentiveness, which keeps us bouncing, which creates more attentiveness, which keeps us bouncing, and it just kind of goes, and it starts, like the wavelengths start bouncing rapidly. And so if you think about social media and the way that social media operates, it's a series of algorithms, and every time you click on something, it reinforces and perpetuates your bias, because, whether you believe it or not, because you are seeking out that information. So be very aware of how you seek out information on the internet. It's not just social media, but it also happens in your search engines and your browsers. So, if you want to kind of avoid this to some degree, first of all, do broad searches. Look at a variety of resources and delete your cookies and your data, or browse incognito. You probably already know that. You guys were born with a keyboard in your hand. So there's a lot to think about. Obviously, we have a lot more. I've got another whole couple of pages of notes, but we're going to start right there because I'm about to run out of time. Finally, before I go, if we look again at this affective intelligence theory, basically is a construct, is a social construct that keeps us safe. And it ends in an evaluation or attribution of blame or credit. So these are places where racism, sexism, ageism, all of the isms really begin to emerge. And they're difficult ideologies to deconstruct in terms of making change. So bias is strong. It is very, very strong, and it is definitely something to be aware of. Now you have access to a couple of ways that bias occurs. We'll talk a little bit more about this, and we'll apply this a little bit more to argument as we go. All right, have a great day.